All right, so I'm delighted to present this paper, which we've been a project, which we've been working on for some months now. Before I get started, I'd like to, do a little bit of recognition and some thanks. I think it's important, both coming from Canada and from Australia to do a land acknowledgement of especially in the city of Toronto, which is the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and in Australia, at least within Canberra, the traditional custodians of the land, paying respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation. I'd also like to, say big thanks to, the team members here. So in particular, we'll start with Michael Neblo, his team at the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability, who's very much the inspiration of this project, has been such a fantastic partner, and we're deeply grateful and very lucky to be working very closely with you on this very paper as well. I'd also like to thank the Office of Andrew Leigh, who's been such a fantastic partner in this as well, and working with us on the issue and engaging with the residents in the way that he did, and his staff member. And then, of course, some of other additional members that have helped us along the way. And one particular is Wendy Russell. So thanks to you as well. So welcome to our paper on From Elected to Connected, Designing for Recursive Representation. And so just a brief outline of what I'm going to go through here is, just a general understanding of, the problem of representative democracy, which kind of grounds, us thinking through potential solutions, which is, the normative theory of recursive representation, and thinking through one of the practical applications to kind of to work through this, which is directly representative democracy, specifically connecting to Congress in the United States. And then our iteration and adaptation to the Australian context, which is connecting to Parliament. And then we'll jump into some key findings and 3 design proposals in our conclusion. So we start with the very common idea, which many of us are going to be very familiar with, which is the crisis of democracy. Now, the crisis of democracy is manifested in a multitude of ways. And so there are a great deal of challenges that are facing democracy that we can note, and many studies which highlight the sort of disconnect that exists between elected officials and between constituents. Now, we're really focused here on one particular manifestation of this crisis, which is the crisis of representation. So the crisis of representation in representative democracy. And so this is, really gears us towards focusing on the disconnection directly between representatives and the represented, and how to think through this. And so one of the challenges that we have here is that, MPs are elected, but the bigger question is, how connected are they to their own communities? And so there is some research that suggests certain levels of disconnection between political parties, between voters and political representatives and legislative institutions. And so we want to kind of think through, sort of the democratic innovations that can address this. And so we start by asking 2 main questions here. And here we have, how can democratic innovations help to address the crisis of representation? And related to that is, what are the innovative ways of thinking about and practicing representation, which is something that, connecting to Parliament is specifically focused on. And so part of answering this is thinking through the different sorts of ways that, representation has been thought about, and also how it's been practiced. And, just at a high level, there's three sorts of ways that we kind of think through this. Is that you have the general standard account of representation, something that, many from a post-war angle think about this in terms of electoral democracy, a stable theory of electoral democracy. And generally what it's considered is a sort of connection or authorization between constituents who vote in and their elected officials, and how those elected officials act on their behalf. Now, of course, there have been other theoretical accounts that have sort of thought through and challenged this sort of notion through a participatory and deliberative accounts of representation. We have here from our own center, discursive representation. We have other forms of self-authorized representation. And we can think about different ways that democracy is not, or democratic representation is not really only represented by that sort of connection between constituents and elected officials, but also amongst themselves. And this can be thought about in terms of social movements and deliberative mini publics and all sorts of other sorts of innovative practices. But more recently, it's been interesting to note that within the literature on representation, there's sort of been a kind of a 180, because what happened between, the sort of standard account and the critiques coming out of the participatory and deliberative wave is we're finding that, representatives need to be brought back into the discussion a little bit more. And here we're starting to think through a little bit more iterative, co-constitutive ways in which representation is actually being practiced. And so two of these, or three of these, here is Jane Mandridge, which I'm going to jump into in a moment, and also Michael Neblos, who we build our case study off of. And so these are interesting ways that are trying to build different sorts of deliberative connections between constituents and the representative, and so as to further our notions and practices of representation, hopefully with the intention of sort of, repairing that sort of disconnect. And so at a high level, Jane Mansbridge thinks about recursive representation, and this is kind of a really good graphic that she highlights here, is the sort of co-constitutive relationship between elected officials and between constituents. And so here, the sort of connections are more than two-way. They really are recursive. They happen in multiple spaces. And the objective here is to deepen the understanding of each other, and it's a good recursive form of representation and practice. It involves communication that's grounded in mutual respect and absence of power. Now, there are a couple ways to sort of radically restructure representation in this way, and the one that we specifically focus on in terms of Mansbridge's is the sort of idea that a representative now can become an interlocutor for the sorts of interests that representatives have, and how that might be transmitted into other legislative forums. And another actual sort of radical form of communicative restructuring is changing the basis of partisanship and how it operates, and loosening that sort of control. And so some of the applications of recursive representation are really starting to take off and as some of you are going to be familiar with a lot of these, right? We have recent citizens' assemblies, including elected MPs, specifically in Ireland, also on other forms of controversial topics in the UK as well. The permanent citizens' assembly, potentially grounded in legislature by law, but connected also to legislative institutions. And then on the other end, we have informal kitchen tables between elected officials that host these sort of informal conversations with the representatives. And then, of course, what I have highlighted here is directly representative democracy, which we're going to turn to. And so directly representative democracy, which is developed by Michael Nebel, our guest here at the talk right now, is a proposal for building a more direct, inclusive, and deliberative connection between citizens and government officials. And the basic idea here is that there need to be more opportunities for citizens to connect directly to the representatives, but it's more than that. The goal really is to hone the relationship. It's to hone the sorts and types of deliberation that happen, and in order to, you know, build the stronger connections, but also to create, hopefully, more legitimate relationships as well. And so in thinking about this, Michael Nebel's team, and I highly suggest reading this book, it's fantastic, is to revise the classic town hall. And many of you I'm sure lots of you have been to town halls. I've been to a few, and they really degenerate into shouting matches, at least the ones that I have. It's to really reframe this sort of town hall, because it is, you know, a really classic connection between constituents and representatives. And so here, what Michael Nebel's team was thought about building a process that gets a cross section of residents that are assigned to 3 control groups. You know, sets neutral technical ground rules for how participation can operate, provides high-level background information that is accessible to the public, and ensures that the process is moderated and unscripted. And so also part of the process is, you know, administering pre and post surveys to sort of kind of generate an understanding of how attitudes change over time through the process itself. And so they've run several with several members of Congress on issues related to terrorism and immigration policy, and have had direct conversations. Interestingly, these processes themselves, even just attending one of them, you know, changes certain types of attitudes and behaviors towards the constituencies have to their elected officials. And so this is kind of the basis for what we wanted to run a conversation with constituents in Australia, in Fenner in particular, and to sort of iterate on this process a little bit. And so we wanted to build directly representative Australia in the Australian context, and we call it Connecting to Parliament. And so there's a whole bunch of information about the process, and that's on the website there. And so just to give a high level recap of our process and how we worked through it and the issue, basically what happened in the middle of 2020, we had a meeting with Andrew Leigh at the time, who was interested in hosting a conversation with residents, is to think through, you know, potential issues that we can focus on. And it just so happened, you know, auspiciously that a conscious vote was happening, and these are very rare. They happen maybe once every electoral term, and they're generally, you know, relate to things and issues that are bioethical issues, and it's a very excellent opportunity where the sort of partisan dynamic is loosened and people are allowed to vote their conscience on issues. And so this was a great opportunity to sort of bring the issue back to the constituency. And so the issue that was being considered at the time was mitochondrial donation. And so that's a reproductive technology which can essentially, it doesn't necessarily cure, but it really does help with the limitation of, or the passing on of mitochondrial DNA disease from a woman carrying it to their baby. And generally speaking, it is a fatal condition for young children. And so this really is an important issue. So at present, there are 2 pieces of legislation that prevent this practice from occurring. And that's the Research Involving Human Embryos Act and the Prohibition of Human Cloning. Nonetheless, you know, legislation that is moving towards potentially considering reform started with a Senate inquiry in 2018, which reported and then led to a working committee and future public consultations on that. And so we were able to kind of draw from that. And so our Connecting to Parliament process, you know, went to work on sending out an invitation to everybody in the constituency with an invitation to participate. Everybody had the opportunity to indicate a desire on an online portal. And from there, we filtered based off of demographic characteristics to attend 2 forums in particular. So we held an online forum and we held an in-person forum with constituents on this topic. And so this is just a brief example here, and we have the wonderful Leigh that was moderating for us. And so the features here was it's a 90-minute webinar on the GoToWebcast platform, moderated strictly by a third party. It was live, unscripted, and residents asked questions directly to the MP via the chat box, and they each get a chance to reciprocate on that. And here's an example of the in-person forum. And we have Wendy Russell here, who did a great job facilitating. So we tried to keep these as similar as possible. This was 60 minutes, neutrally moderator, live, unscripted. Residents would go up to the mic and ask questions. But as is the case in many in-person forums, there was an inclination to have a brief in-person discussion about this and return back to the conversation to ask Anjali some questions. And so this kind of leads us into our empirical findings and our method. So can deliberative town halls like this bring the principles of recursive representation to life? And so I'll briefly note that we did administer pre and post surveys quantitatively, and that data is being aggregated to help with understanding that. And we also, in addition, did qualitative research, which this specific presentation and paper is based off of. And so Nardine, our awesome team member, went to work on doing roughly 35 interviews with participants from both the in-person and from the online forums. We did some observation of both town halls. We all participated in thematic analysis. And interestingly, the way that we sort of approach this methodologically is abductively, right? So we do work through our own normative principles and standards at the center, and we wanted to feedback. We wanted to iterate on some of these sort of normative ideas based off of our findings from actual participant interviews, and sort of think through both of these. And so jumping into the overview of some of our empirical findings, overall citizens were very positive about their experience with the deliberative town hall. And it really indicated that citizens are really willing to take part in deliberative town halls on these issues. And you can really get a sense that part of this is also because they do have a feeling that Australian democracy is something that is facing significant challenges, but this is one of the ways to actually sort of counteract that, and they're more than willing to attend these. And so they definitely appreciate the particular forms of these structured spaces which allow them to meet face-to-face with and interact with their representative. So you can see from the quotes here that it acts as a very sort of personal atmosphere. And some of them noted, seeing Andrew, for example, with a cup of coffee, in such an unscripted space was a really good thing to see. But all that said is that ultimately, these deliberative town halls can enable recursive representation to the degree that, they're meeting, normative criteria. And in this circumstance, we found that deliberative capacity is an interesting way to think about recursive representation and directly representative democracy. And a lot of these normative ideas really do overlap. So authenticity, inclusion, and consequentiality is what I'm going to jump into in the next section. So our qualitative findings with participants, the participants themselves really help unpack our ability to think theoretically about the issues of representation. So here you see an example of what the room looked like. This is COVID standard. So we had socially distanced meeting, and it was a lively event. And so norm one of three is authenticity. And so recursive representation, as we find it, requires authentic discussion with their elected representatives. And the way that authenticity is defined is a quality of communication that demonstrates several features. And one of them is non-coercion and non-manipulation. And so what we really heard here is that this relates to a lack of party discipline. And so that's such a big thing in thinking about how, this context opened up the space for us to have a conversation with less party line, and the participants just greatly appreciated that. Another feature of authenticity is reciprocal sharing of reasons and considerations on the certain issues that are at stake, and an active listening, which is something that the participants really noted, that Andrew was a very good active listener. And we also think that this is part of the design features in a way, because Andrew was there, generally to listen and learn from the participants, because this process itself was going to determine how Andrew was going to vote in Parliament on the conscious issue. So we can see a couple quotes here, specifically honing in on the fact that, that they really don't like a focus strictly on party line, and they would rather hear, more authentic answers, which they felt that Andrew was more likely to do in this sort of scenario. So norm 2 of 3 is inclusion. And so recursive representation requires inclusive deliberation where the views of constituents are balanced with the views of experts. Now, in this scenario, I think it's important to note that we consciously did not include experts, and there's good reasons that we didn't as well. But nonetheless, we're basing our findings, and I'm willing to engage in that conversation later in the discussion, but based on our findings, what the participants did end up noting was that because of the scientific expertise, and because Andrew Leigh wasn't necessarily there to persuade the audience on his stance, they were looking for a little bit more scientific expertise on the sort of the legal and perhaps even the more technical challenges that are related to this issue. At the same time, there were some concerns about whether or not we were hearing from those with lived experience of mitochondrial disease as well. And so this sort of, raises questions about how we potentially iterate on the design itself, which is something I'll get to later on. And so as we can see here, one participant notes that a bit concerned the forum wasn't necessarily representative of the whole issue. And so some of the voices that, the people that had experienced mitochondrial disease might not have been there. And so these are things that we are definitely going to have to think about as well going forward. And so norm 3, consequentiality. And so recursive representation requires that the sort of issues that are being talked about have some sort of consequential impact. And it just so happens that we were very fortunate to have, a conscious vote that the elected official was willing to base this conversation and process on. And so here, what we start to find out from the participants is that they really appreciate this sort of dynamic where the deliberative calls were, more than just talk, even in general, more than what, the standard form of engagement with an MP. They found that this was different in that regard. And that ultimately that they really feel the desire to have an impact on formal decision-making processes. And so we can see a couple quotes here and indicators that, for example, I'm interested in the whole idea of how citizens get control of what's going on, or just having town halls about stuff where, everything is already settled. So the issue is something important as well here. And so to conclude, we, in thinking about designing recursive representation, we sort of have, three implications that we're considering here. And one is the sort of communicative role of elected MPs. And what we're suggesting here is that given the way that our process unfolded, particularly because our representative wasn't there to convince anybody of a party policy or party position, that the idea here was more about establishing an authentic communication and connection. And here it was an emphasis on active listening. And so this design implication, is something that we can think about going forward because of just generally how positively favorable it was by the participants. Also necessarily, something that we should consider is a multi-actor relationship. So in the context of recursive representation, it might require inclusive communication where actors other than representatives and represented might be needed. And that's just based off of, potentially considering experts, potentially considering those with lived experience, how to sort of balance that with the format of the conversation. And then ultimately having a dynamic approach to design and openness to learn from previous practices. And so we were very open to iterating across teams, which is why we led to, and the first, what I'm pretty confident is the first type of connecting to Parliament process iterated on directly representative democracy, because we had the in-person forum. And so we're willing to iterate on this project going forward as well to kind of think through, how to advance some of these ideas. And if anyone's interested in viewing the videos, for example, those are posted on Connecting to Parliament. And we have the working paper that I'm more than willing to circulate. You can just get a hold of me at any point. And that's it.